I'd like to welcome our final speaker of this morning, David Benqué. Please come up to the stage, David. Yes, he's a designer and researcher who aims to creatively question the roles that science and technology play in society. And please take it away.
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, so as Michelle says, I'm a designer and researcher, and the kind of core idea or claim I'm interested in at the moment is this idea that the future can be predicted from data. And so this is basically what I'm going to talk about today. It's kind of a work in progress, so I'm going to show you mainly some of my research to date, and then a little kind of proof of concept of how I'm turning this into a kind of practice project. So this is a project that I'm working on called the Monistic Almanac, which is basically taking numbers as its Prima Materia to fit with the theme of the conference. So on the evening of the 21st of January, 1759, Comet Halley returned. And this was a special return because it had actually been predicted by quite a few people, and this was quite a big deal. It was this kind of Newtonian triumph, and it kind of, to me, is a kind of poster example of the discoveries and the kind of progress that was being made in astronomy in the 17th and 18th century. Which can basically be summed up in the kind of mathematics of smoothing an orbit path. And this has huge consequences, not just for science, but also for society as a whole. The core thing here is that a smoothed orbit curve is truer than any of the individual kind of point observations that you can make, because these are kind of prone to error. But if you can mathematically smooth a curve through them, you're actually closer to truth than any of the things that you've observed. And so these mathematics were then applied by analogy to lots of other domains and to society as well, which is basically like saying if we can predict the stars or Comet Halley, we can predict pretty much everything. Astronomer Adolf Quetelet did this through his theory of the average man, which is basically the same idea than the orbit, but applied to man. So this average man was truer or closer to real human nature than any kind of individual person, which is potentially like a flawed version of this perfect thing. His theory was called social physics, and the aim was to literally facilitate the recognition of laws analogous to those of celestial dynamics in the domain of society. So he went on to predict marriages, suicides, and also crime with this kind of theory. And so two geographers, Barnes and Wilson, retraced this history of social physics to the present day, and they kind of highlight the core kind of principle at work here, which is this idea of monism. The idea that there is only one set of principles that applies to the explanation of both natural and social worlds. So this kind of like general laws of motion that are driving the universe. So this history, they trace it from Quetelet, but all the way through, as I said, to the present day. And they're geographers, so they do this through the history of mapping and computer mapping technology. This is one of the examples. This is a population potential map, which uses basically the math of, or the physics of gravitational potential to the distribution of population. So in this case, the analogy is like population is a kind of viscous liquid spreading out from New York onto the land. And so for them, it's this kind of example is a way to start to unpack the kind of historical burden, as they say, of big data. I guess this is already a few years old, so today we'd say AI or machine learning. And so this monistic stance or position is, you could argue, still visible in contemporary data science or machine learning, when the same maths are applied to the prediction of anything from credit scores to product recommendations or disease risk. And their position is quite interesting to me because it's challenging this kind of constant focus and claims to newness, whereas actually, as soon as you start changing the vocabulary, so instead of calling it AI, you start calling it automated statistics, which it kind of is, you start opening up these very long and complex lineages of history, like the history of statistics, going back at least 300 years to things like the return of Halley. Another way in which astronomy influenced society is in the domain of economics and finance. There were lots of overlaps, so often the same people were doing both. And a lot of techniques were borrowed from one to the other. So things like double entry bookkeeping were actually astronomical techniques to begin with. And this contributed, according to Ashworth, to this kind of view of the world, an accountant's view of the world, which also borrowed so not only the math, but also the kind of legitimacy of science in a kind of 19th century climate fraught with uncertainty and mistrust, where people started doubting the legitimacy of wealth. They kind of set out to legitimize speculation by bundling it up with science, basically. Our guy, Halley, is also one of the first to draw up a life insurance table. And so he was kind of like part of both gangs. And so this accountant's view of the world is exemplified in the Almanac, which is basically a publication of all the numbers. So this is units, loan tables, unit conversions, but also stars, weather, eclipses, and so on. So in here you can see they're not next to each other in the actual book, but they're cohabiting in the same issue. On the left you have interest on loans, and on the right you have positions of planets. And so these almanacs caught my attention as a designer, as a kind of format to be examined or potentially subverted. They're very peculiar publications. They're kind of guides to the future. They're always published for the year ahead. And they serve as these kinds of guides in many, many different areas. So you have nautical almanacs, but also obviously farming almanacs, but also celebrity, kind of royal family ones, or trading, etc. And depending on the area or the publication, you get a different ratio of kind of science to mysticism to miscellaneous, all mixed together in these publications. And so to me, it seems like quite an appropriate and interesting format through which to interrogate the kind of aesthetic relationship with data, but also with this notion of prediction. So rather than using the language of AI or like high-tech analysis, I found it quite interesting to move the discourse to another register and examine these kinds of ideas of cosmic forces acting on everyday life. And of course, almanacs play a big role in Back to the Future, where 50 years of complete sports statistics are contained in this thin volume. In 2015, Adrienne Lafrance in The Atlantic drew a parallel between the Farmer's Almanac and basically our smartphones. So she kind of positioned the almanacs as a precursor to the way we use our smartphones today. And so this is also a kind of handle for me, extending this to thinking about the almanac as a kind of maybe also a precursor for data science and machine learning practices. This is the editor of the almanac quoted in the article. And so you can see this recurring idea of the general laws of motion coming back, the universe as a machine. Once you get the operating instructions, you can tell the future. And this kind of resonates with the famous claim by Anderson in Wired magazine in 2008, the end of theory. And so for him, not only are there general laws of motion, but the machines can actually figure them out for us. If only we can give them enough information, they'd be able to give us the smooth, true orbit. And so what I like about the almanac is that in contrast with these big claims, it doesn't take itself too seriously. So this kind of attitude of useful with a pleasant degree of humor seems quite appealing to me. And you always see this kind of mix between the scientific and the miscellaneous. So you have remedies, kind of rumors. There's kind of almost like a tabloid characteristic to it. So you find in almanacs, you find the kind of expected epiphanies tables, calendars, dates of or times of sunrise, sunset, etc. But also a whole bunch of other stuff that gets mixed up. All sorts of beliefs and wisdoms, all coming from different traditions and mythologies that kind of get represented as this strange vernacular of symbols and different fonts all cohabiting together. There are tables on the best days to do certain things like quit smoking, begin a diet, cut your hair, start or end projects, which I'm sure each of these lines could be a pitch for a startup. There are predictions on the best days to go fishing. The Old Moors Almanac is more on the kind of dubious end of the almanac spectrum. This is like astrology territory. In this example of the kind of 3 vignettes for each month as a kind of tarot card reading for world news. So this is this month. So we have until the end of the month to figure out a UK-EU treaty, which, good luck with that. And also these kinds of astrological tips for lottery numbers. In the trader's version, it's quite interesting. It provides the kind of historical minimums and maximums for each day of the year. So you can easily read the kind of obsession with ranking yourself against history that's kind of carried into that, and also these markers for bullish or bearish market for each of the dates, predicted up to a year in advance, which is quite an achievement. But so what's encapsulated, or what I find interesting in these publications is a kind of broader idea or broader theme that's also present in today's data predictions. This kind of blurring of lines that were never really that clear, but that are now kind of being obscured by these mathematics. So the lines between science and mystical or mythical beliefs, between astrology and astronomy, and between economics and gambling. So here on the left you have a birth chart, an astrological birth chart. And on the right you have a scientific study from Columbia University, I think, which is basically a data analysis of how your birth month affects your lifetime disease risk. So how actually different are these two things? And what's particularly interesting to me is that under cover of this objective kind of data science, the belief systems that are encoded into it are actually, pretty similar. And also examples outside of the almanac, these kinds of new kinds of superstitions and beliefs where suddenly the trained autocorrect on your phone becomes also a predictor for the year ahead. And these are things that are not happening in the pages of Wired magazine or something, but casually kind of on Twitter. No, I'm going to skip 4chan for once. So what I'm doing with this project is kind of reappropriating all these ideas and kind of making my own version of the almanac, using it as a kind of site to critically investigate data predictions. A bit like critical design kind of satirized the aesthetics of mass manufacturing, I'm kind of doing the same thing with publication formats and aesthetics. Or at least I'm aiming to do the same thing. So it's kind of a thinking through practice and to see how far I can push this kind of monistic ideal into a kind of absurd extreme. So this started as a small 3-day book sprint workshop that I did in Saint-Étienne with French design students last November. And I'm now kind of pushing this using the tools of modern data science. So the kind of thing I'm going to show you now is the kind of proof of concept or like a prototype of one of the things that I might be doing in this context. So the core idea is the cosmic corn chart. This is a prediction of the price of corn based on the positions of the planets in the solar system. It uses the kind of core data science stack in Python. So I'm using NumPy, Pandas, scikit-learn, and also Skyfield, which is a library to access the solar system data, the ephemeris from JPL NASA. And I'm writing all this in a format which is called the Jupyter Notebook, which allows you to have code and images and other elements together, which is a classic in kind of data science world. So my features are these curves. These are the distances, barycentric distances of the planets in the solar system. So the distance to the center of gravity of the solar system. This is me having to go back 300 years to get the min and max for each orbit because of Pluto being a pain. And the target is the price of corn. So this is the price of corn for the last just about 30 years. Corn is an interesting choice because it's one of the first things that became traded as a future. So there's an amazing chapter in Cronon's Nature's Metropolis, the history of Chicago, about how that happened, which I highly recommend. It's basically a kind of convergence of different technologies which basically abstracted corn and made it the first kind of commodity to be traded as a future. And especially the efforts to differentiate these future contracts from gambling, which was outlawed, are really fascinating. So I end up with this kind of table, which is kind of reminiscent of the almanac, with 30 years of planet positions and corn prices. I use this to train a machine learning algorithms called a support vector machine for every day. And then I fed it the dates for the year ahead, and it gave me the prices of corn for the next 365 days. So when I put it all together, this is the kind of chart that could make up my new kind of version of the almanac with trading advice based on these on these theories. So this is what I'm going to develop over the summer. I'm hoping to have not just this, but maybe a collection of these pairings to see basically how far I can take this. So coming back to our theme of Prima Materia, I think in this case what I'm kind of examining as this Prima Materia is this notion of raw data. This claim that this material is a kind of unmediated, neutral measure of nature or society. As Lisa Gittelman called it, the fundamental stuff of truth itself. She called it that before arguing that instead, data must be understood as framed and framing, that is socially and culturally constructed. So there is no such thing as raw data. That's not to say that socially and culturally constructed is necessarily a bad thing, but what might be problematic is the pretense to an objective truth. So what I'm doing is kind of actively constructing some of these systems myself in the hope that by shifting the coordinates and kind of changing the underlying belief systems, might kind of get a new grasp on what is going on, not just purely technically, but also culturally, and being able to connect all that to the kind of history that I talked to you about. One example in the raw data book actually relates to the next data set. So probably my next target is this data set of 5,000 years of solar eclipses. That's also a NASA data set. And Stanley, also in the Gittelman raw data book, talks about this, the fact that this eclipse data seems at first like a pretty easy kind of objective measure of the position of the moon. In fact, the fact that we have this data kind of 3,000 years in advance is a kind of illustration of that. However, there are subtle changes in that motion called secular acceleration, which complicates everything. So this data, basically no astronomers have managed to completely agree with it. And you have people, instead of just calculating these smoothness, going back to kind of accounts of battles in ancient Greece to see whether anyone mentions an eclipse to kind of verify the calculations. So these supposedly raw, easy to plot data are in fact constructed through these deep historical investigations and continue to bedevil the calculations of lunar motions today. That's me. Thank you very much.
Instead of the mic drop, the mic bump, maybe. Does anyone have any questions for David? No? I would like to know more about the almanac that you are making and what you hinted at the next data set that you're going to look at. But it's interesting that you started with corn. I mean, kind of this, my mind instantly jumped to this kind of contentious nature of we're addicted to high fructose corn syrup, like it's kind of...
Yeah, there's so much with corn.
There's so much with corn.
And it's also like, I've been looking at so many farmers' almanacs, it kind of makes sense as well.
Of course, of course.
So, I think there are quite a few good reasons to start with corn. I guess it was actually, once I had trained my algorithm, it took actually a couple of days to decide what to predict, because I was like, I worked so hard to kind of like get this system working, and okay, now what do I do? I think thinking through, that's why I want to try and iterate through different kind of pairings or relationships is kind of the core interest. So I don't want it to be about corn. It's about the prediction and the kind of principles and beliefs behind all that.
Yeah, and depending, I suppose, on how long you run the project and produce the almanacs, you can also track your own success rate, or what have you.
No, absolutely, yeah. So I imagine this being a kind of ticking online publication. So you'd get predictions for the next 365 days every day, kind of thing. Yeah.
Oh, so it's just like a rolling almanac almost.
Yeah, exactly. So instead of doing it, in December for
like,
the year ahead,
here you go for
could
the
have
next
a
year.
rolling
Yeah. Great. Okay, great.
Right, thank you.
Thank you.